Oh, and going from the sublime to the ridiculous, I want to conclude this podcast by talking about a lawsuit that was just filed against the McDonald's Corporation from 52 former black franchise owners. They used to own McDonald's franchises. They don't own them anymore. They're suing McDonald's for $1 billion in damages, which comes to what, $20 million per franchisee, which seems like a lot of money that they claim to have lost for these damages. But this is basically what they're alleging. They're saying that McDonald's discriminated against them by steering them to depressed, crime-ridden neighborhoods and setting them up for failure. They're saying that McDonald's saddled them with a standard 20-year franchise agreement with stores requiring higher security and higher insurance costs, and whose $2 million average annual sales from 2011 to 2016 were $700,000 below the nationwide norm. As a result of having restaurants in crime-ridden areas with lower sales, oftentimes they went bankrupt. And they're saying this is McDonald's fault, that somehow McDonald's forced them to open up these restaurants and deliberately set them up for failure, which makes no sense. I mean, why would McDonald's want their own franchisees to fail? I mean, it is a symbiotic relationship. They want the franchisees to succeed so that they can succeed. So they didn't deliberately set them up for failure, but they failed. I mean, restaurants fail all the time. Businesses fail all the time. That's why it's so risky to go into business. That's why so many people choose not to do it. They go for the security of a paycheck, a steady paycheck. They don't want to risk entrepreneurship. But clearly, McDonald's did not force these franchisees to open up restaurants in neighborhoods that had more crime. I mean, look, people are opening up restaurants in the communities in which they live, most likely. So if you have a black community, there's a high probability that the person who wants to open up a restaurant in that community, who also lives in that community, may in fact be black himself or herself. So I'm sure that these franchisees wanted to open restaurants in their neighborhoods, in their communities. It's not McDonald's fault that there was a lot of crime in their neighborhood. Why are you going to blame McDonald's for that crime? You know, I just went over talking about how, looting. This woman is saying that there's no victims in looting, that it's not real violence. It doesn't really cost anybody any money. Well, here you have these franchisees pointing out the cost of crime, of theft, meaning that the restaurants had to pay higher costs for security. Maybe there were more people that weren't paying for meals, whatever. There was losses due to theft. And because of that, they weren't profitable. But I'm sure not every McDonald's or Burger King or fast food restaurant in these communities failed, but a number of them did. I mean, what is McDonald's supposed to do? Deny franchise agreements to anybody in a bad neighborhood? Because what would happen if they did that? What if McDonald's said, oh, no, we're not going to allow any McDonald's in these black neighborhoods because there's too much crime? I mean, they would really be sued for that. So they offered these individuals the opportunity. They gave them a standard agreement, the same agreement they give everybody. They're not saying they gave them a worse agreement. They're saying, hey, you gave us the same agreement that you gave all the white folks. You gave us the exact same agreement, and you knew that we would fail because you knew that there's so much more crime in these black communities that we couldn't possibly be profitable. We needed special treatment, right? You needed a special deal for black franchisees that would incorporate all these higher costs and these higher risks. I mean, give me a break. This whole thing is absolutely ridiculous. But you know what? Who knows? It may work. They get a sympathetic jury if somehow this case doesn't get thrown out of court and they get to a jury. You never know. Maybe McDonald's is going to have to cough up the money. And, this is not going to end with McDonald's. I believe that we have set ourselves up for a wave, an epidemic of lawsuits, of racially motivated discrimination lawsuits, where former employees, black employees of every major company, are going to get together to get a huge payday by claiming that they were the victims of discrimination. Because after all, if we have accepted the false premise that we have systemic racism, and the proof that we have systemic racism is the murder of George Floyd, which is why nobody wants to admit that it was a drug overdose. They need it to be a murder because this murder is what proves the systemic racism. But once we've accepted the false premise that there is systemic racism, well, now all of these suits could succeed because every problem that somebody had, if you're an African American and your business failed or you lost money or something bad happened to you, it's obviously because some racist did it to you. Some racist corporation or racist individual, they intentionally inflicted this harm on you because you're black, right? And now you can sue. And now the juries are able to take it upon themselves to be the basic deliverers of reparations. They'll simply look at this as, a down payment on some type of slavery reparations, and they're going to slap all these big companies with massive awards because they're going to think, hey, it doesn't really cost any money. It's a major corporation. What do they care? And here's these poor oppressed people whose great-great-great-great-grandparents were slaves, and they need money. And this is what's going to happen. And I think it's going to be rampant through the S&P 500. You're going to have lots of these lawsuits, one after another, especially if they win, or if these companies settle. Because once they start settling and writing checks, right, it's like, waving, blood at a shark, right? These lawyers are going to smell that blood, and they're going to come, from all over with new false claims looking to get a check. Right. And so this is what's going to happen. And what is it going to do? It is going to undermine the competitiveness of American businesses, because now American businesses, in order to stay in business, are going to be forced to pay this rent, this extra rent. They're going to be writing all these checks to lawyers based on bogus discrimination claims, and they're going to end up having to settle them. And again, what is this going to do to the small firms? The small firms, it's going to make them even less likely, even more reluctant to hire African Americans. They're going to be scared, out of their wits to do that because nobody is going to want to subject themselves to this type of litigation. And the only way that a small employer can mitigate the potential legal damage is simply not to hire African Americans. The larger companies can't do that. Because then they'll be sued because of it'll be obvious because they won't have enough African-American employees. But if you're a small business and you got 3, 4, 5 employees and none of them are black, nobody can say you discriminated. It's not a large enough pool. And so even if you have some really, really good quality black applicants that you really want to hire, a lot of people are going to think twice about taking that risk. And a lot of people will end up going for a white guy, even though they actually prefer the black guy because they just can't take the risk of this type of litigation. And it's going to be much bigger, right? As a result of Black Lives Matter, as a result of all this, there's actually going to be more discrimination against African Americans. And of course, they're going to blame that on racism, even though racism will have absolutely nothing to do with it. It will simply be economics and government that will be driving it. But of course, the left will like it because now it's going to create even more problems for African Americans. And now the left can blame that on racism and use that again to get their votes, to continue to solidify their power and continue to push this socialist agenda under the veil of combating systemic racism, when the whole purpose is simply to use the myth of racism to destroy capitalism.